His background is extensive. I'm not going to cover that. It's all on the leaflets. I'll just pass you over to Peter and we'll crack on.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you for the invitation. There's been a couple of years of Zoom conferences, and it's so nice to actually be amongst real people. And somebody asked me just as I was coming in, is there a climate crisis? Do I believe it's an emergency? So I thought, okay, let's do a little poll, because the Stroud Council, I imagine, have already decided that there is an emergency. Certainly Glastonbury Town Council voted on it and have decided that there is a climate emergency. Somerset County Council have decided and declared a climate emergency. Our own Parliament has declared a climate emergency. So what does this actually mean? And so I thought I would do a quick straw poll as to what it means to you now, because this is your political reality. You're living in a political setup that has declared an emergency, and as we have seen from 2 years of the COVID emergency and the declaration of that by the UN and so forth, there are lots of consequences of having an emergency. Suddenly all the values and safeguards and regulations and rules that had been built up over many generations, particularly in terms of freedom to speak, access to the media and so forth, a lot of this changed with COVID. And now we're entering the climate emergency. So again, there will be lots of changes that are already in train. So how many of you are really worried about the climate, that you feel there is an emergency and that you're convinced of the narrative? Okay. Well, this is helpful for me. I would like to be able to show you that there are many voices, important voices. My voice isn't that important, but the Director General of the World Meteorological Organization, the UN establishment, a couple of years ago said, please don't use that word emergency or crisis. It's really not appropriate. And within 2 or 3 months, with his job on the line, he backed down and became quiet. The UN Special Scientific Panel on Climate Change, the scientists, the IPCC, they have also said in their weighty documents, most of which I've read, if only people would stop calling it a crisis and an emergency. It's not really, but they didn't really put that out very much. And there are a number of scientists, really senior scientists, who are saying it's really not helpful because we're not 100% sure which way the climate is going to go. So I'll give you some background on what I think the climate is doing, and I've got lots of graphs and data, and I know that for people who perhaps don't have a scientific education, you see a graph and you just go, graph. So I'll do my best not to bombard you with data, and also not to put my opinion at the forefront at this stage, because I have a lot of opinions about what's happening, and to give you enough information that you can decide, for yourself, what is the nature of the emergency that we face. I actually do think we do face an emergency. I'm an ecologist by background. I have a scientific education, and my values and what's really dear to me is very largely to do with wildlife, wild places, the countryside. And up until about 2003, I was regularly consulted by government agencies. Prior to that, I'd worked as an advisor all the way up through the European Union, the UN itself, on ocean pollution issues. And we were very successful up until the middle of the 90s. I was Greenpeace's chief advocate at the UN. So I've actually been in the UN framework on the floor of the UN. I know how the scientific committees work. And eventually, after 20 years of working against their policies of regulation, of discharges, of dumping, of dealing with toxic wastes, of dealing with nuclear and radioactive wastes, they eventually said, look, and they said this to me personally because Greenpeace was a little bit difficult at that time, it was beginning to change. Would you come in and help us? We need to change our laws and regulations. And so I've been right inside the corridors of the UN. In that case, it was the World Maritime Organization which dealt with the ocean issues. So I know how the science works, and I know how scientific committees work, and I know what has happened in relation to climate. And at that time, during the 20 years that I was actually Greenpeace's chief scientific advisor on a lot of the risks that were faced very much in the 80s, acid rain, pollution of the oceans, biodiversity loss, whaling, and so forth. I had a small research group in Oxford at the time, and we were consultants to many environmental organizations, trade unions, governments worldwide eventually, and eventually also the EU and the UN. So with that kind of grounding through to the 90s, we'd won most of those battles. And I moved into the realms of conservation, which were closer to my heart. But in 2000, I was asked by the Countryside Agency. Their issue was how to integrate renewable energy into the landscape, how it would affect community, biodiversity. At that time, there was an idea that we would get to 2050, we would have to have about half of our fossil fuels replaced by renewable energy, and that was the year 2000. And so they'd commissioned various pieces of work, and nothing really helped them. And so I had a small team, and we designed a computer program which would simulate landscapes, and you could place within the landscape any technology that you liked. So for example, here you have wind turbines, these are biomass power stations, and you can fly into that landscape. And the idea was to provide local decision makers, regional councils, county councils and so forth, with a planning tool. So for example, if you just went ahead willy-nilly without proper consideration of biodiversity, landscape and community, then what you would get would be new roads, biomass power stations, that's a biomass power station, big turbines on the hills, commercial forestry, forest residue power stations, all without very much consideration for the impact of these renewables. Or you could be much more considerate. So you could have rewilded hills, no sheep, and no turbines on the hills. Smaller turbines, maximum solar PV. This is actually a biomass power station, low profile, no new roads, and small scale, that's short rotation coppice, that's willow, providing the power station, you can tractor it in, and so forth. So this was mainly a planning device so that planners could see what choices they had. And the next step would have been that you could click on any one point here and get all of the impacts. So if you wanted to know the size of a power station, how many lorries per day, what it would discharge, all that information could be made available. And the idea would be then to develop this for schools so that every sixth form in the country would have a map of their own region, like Somerset, for example, and they could develop all their IT skills and learn something about how energy is provided and what it's used for and so forth. So it was an educational tool, and it took us about 3 years, and it looks a bit kind of Legoland at the moment, but this is 20 years old technology. If we did the same thing now, it would be photorealistic, it would be quite amazing. So what you can do inside the computer, just like a little black box, you fly in and you take a photo. So that's the same town, and that's the same low-profile biomass power station. And I sat on a government agency committee whose task was to integrate. It was called Community Renewables Initiative. We all sat round a table in Whitehall, and the idea was what really is going to serve community and how far can we get down this road and safeguard the things that we really care about. So it's as a consequence of that, it just again shows you some of those choices. You could have a new nuclear power station, you could have everything effectively, giant turbines, biomass power station, large onshore wind. You could have no onshore wind, put all the turbines offshore, decentralized power, combined heat and power, and something that I was interested in at the time. Instead of developing your estuary with, say, hydro or tidal, you could actually rewild it as a carbon sink. So in all of those years of work, that's 3 years, I didn't question the science of carbon dioxide. As a scientist, I'd assumed it was settled, and I didn't know that my colleague from the ocean pollution days had moved on from ocean issues to atmospheric issues. And he was part of the original committee that created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And he was a drafting author of the Kyoto Protocol, which resulted from that in 1995, something like that. And we can talk about that, but that was the main global regulation that was coming in to try and do something about the emissions of carbon dioxide. So that's my essential background. What I realized in 2003, when I looked at the figures, how many turbines, how many biomass power stations, how much areas of forest, how much areas of solar power that would be required, it was very clear Britain couldn't do very much with what land sources that we had. And this has to happen all over the globe. So, for example, something that I care about very much is tropical forests, wild mountains, and so forth. These are, this is probably 10 years old, this graph, dams planned in red, dams under construction in blue, and these are large dams. And these are all in areas of high biodiversity, and they're all in wild areas, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Amazon. This is a dam on the Xingu River in the Amazon, under construction in Brazil, and you can just see the tiny little people and vehicles there, massive. Once they've built that dam, which is built now, they have carbon-free electricity. And then in come the investors and all of the companies that are looking to resource and relocate their production for carbon-free electricity. So it's great for the Brazilian economy. The same is happening in Iceland. The rivers, the wild country. Iceland is now one of the great global centers for aluminium production. Of course, there are impacts. I care a lot about indigenous people. I've spent time in Africa, particularly with indigenous people. And the level of impacts on indigenous people is formidable. I have a lot of friends who've hung out with the Kogi in Colombia. And Colombia is now one of the global providers of biofuels. And there will be Colombian palm oil and various other biofuels in the petrol tanks of almost everyone in Europe at the moment. 400,000 hectares, that's 800,000 acres of land, were cleared of, they weren't indigenous people, because the indigenous, the truly indigenous, are quite well protected. They still have impacts. These were people who didn't really have much in the way of rights, somewhere in between. And they were forcibly moved out by the military. At one point, Colombia had 2 million internally displaced people. And 80% of the palm oil is exported to the EU, 48% to the UK. South East Europe, planned hydro. Again, wilderness places, massive development of hydro. So biofuels and hydro are extraordinarily damaging for wild areas, for biodiversity, for indigenous peoples. Likewise, fracking. When they talk about fracking, they don't show you pictures of the landscape and what happens to fracking. I mean, this is in Texas. They obviously don't care too much about the landscape in Texas. And just to illustrate the size of the problem, this is wind, solar and hydro 2020 UK consumption. And you can see bioenergy and waste, nuclear, gas, petroleum, coal, which we've been phasing out of coal. So there's a long way to go. And if I had more time and more energy, because it's very depressing, I would do the sums and find out exactly how many turbines, how many nuclear power stations, how many biofuel plantations elsewhere would be needed just for Britain. And you can do the sums with electric cars and supplies of lithium and so forth. So somebody needs to do that work. It's been done for the United States particularly, and I can give you links if you want to follow that up. So we're dealing with an emergency in terms of every government has signed on to this, and the UN, and a whole plan to replace what 20 years ago it was, let's replace half of it. Now it's all of it, net zero by 2050. And you won't be able to read all of this very, very clearly, but this is from the latest government report. And what it really shows here, this is all waste energy. The energy that's coming in here, so you have solar PV. You see how small that is? Wind, wave and tidal. You can forget wave and tidal, there's virtually none of that really. And that's hydro. And that's direct energy, electrical output, so there's not much wastage there. Everything else, imported and homegrown biomass, landfill, sewage gas, this is waste. That goes into, again, power generation, and there's a huge loss of energy in power generation, so this is all wasted. And here's your various other sources. This is wood waste. This imported biomass. I'm not sure about that, but where that's exactly coming from. But there's a power station in Yorkshire called Drax. It used to be 4,000 megawatts, that's 4 gigawatts of coal. And it's being slowly transformed to burn wood chip. Now, you cannot imagine what 4 gigawatts of a power station is. It's one of the largest power stations in Europe. And Yorkshire doesn't have a lot of forest. The forests that are being harvested are, well, they used to be in Louisiana, they've now shifted up to Canada. And we were told it's forest waste, but there was a TV program not so long ago which actually went and found out they were cutting down primary forest. So that is shipped as wood chip in vast tankers to Liverpool, where it's met by green trains. They've actually painted them green. And then the wood chip is taken to Drax. And I think 3/4 of Drax now is burning wood chip from the United States. And this is called green. And it's being paid for by the taxpayer. And it's very expensive. And of course it has impacts. So this is what really motivates me to be here. I would hate to visit Northern Ireland right now because I really don't like giant aerospace propellers on stilts marching across the countryside. Some people think they're very graceful, but I like the original wilderness areas, especially uplands. And you'll notice there's not so much happening in southern England. And this is largely because there's been effectively a moratorium, largely by the Conservative government. Whereas the further north you go, the less people are really concerned about that landscape. They don't mind thousands of huge turbines. And you saw how little impact that has made so far. It's about the total renewables at the moment in terms of our total consumption. It's about 4%. 70% is still fossil fuels, 20% nuclear. So that's my motivation. If you do the sums globally, then the impact of replacing fossil fuels by 2050 is huge. It's absolutely massive. It actually can't happen because none of the renewables are in any way cheap. The period of cheap energy is over. And they will say, oh, they're competitive, but they're competitive within a subsidy system that the taxpayer is paying for. But they will try to do this with all of these consequences and impacts, and they will fail. So it would be completely useless. Now, I had at least accepted that, well, we don't want to go to 3 degrees global warming. You really don't want to do that. That's way beyond anything that our ecosystems are used to dealing with. And that would be an average. So there would be regional areas which would be much hotter, much colder. So I thought, I wonder how much time we've really got, because there's so much of a push, and this was more than 10 years, say 15 years ago. The push was already starting. Friends of the Earth were saying, look, we have to sacrifice the landscape. We have to sacrifice wilderness. I was like, whoa, hang on a minute. Is that really necessary? How much time have we got? Because the science was a bit vague, to be honest. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take time out and I'm going to study the science. I want to know how much time we've got. And I have to say, I was shocked. I'm a science policy analyst. I've dealt with nuclear issues where there's been a lot of shenanigans going on about hiding the consequences, hiding the risks and so forth. exposing those risks, working with parliaments. I had never seen such bad science. I couldn't believe it. I then started to go visit the institutes who were producing this stuff, the models, computer models of what the future would look like. And I was received very well. I can talk the language. There was plenty of discussion. And they thought, yeah, you've got some good points. We have problems with the models. We can't put cycles in them. So eventually, I produced a thick scientific report, which I sent to Greenpeace. And I asked for a meeting with one of their ex-directors, because I didn't know the current directors. And we met, I think it was in Madrid. And he wasn't a scientist, so I said, look, these are my conclusions. It could get colder. That they haven't considered cycles. It's really crazy. And he went, oh, he was French. Oh, Peter, you're usually right. I said, yeah, I've always been right. And since when have we ever had a correct science from the UN? So, oh, you should talk to our man in the UN. You have a man in the UN? Yeah, Bob Wood. Ah, oh, Watson, that was it. Okay. And I thought, well, that's the last place that I'm going to find a reception, because they were already what we would now call woke. So I was then approached, because I was giving some talks, by the publishing house that's behind Clairview. And they said, can you produce a book for the public? Now this is, when they got this, it was like, oh, we were thinking of an easy paperback. So it's a little bit dense, and but I think it's readable. That was 2009, and up until then, environmentally, I think I had a bit of credibility. Even my critics were saying, well, he's green, he's an environmentalist. But then a certain journalist, who shall remain nameless, got hold of my autobiography. And I wrote this in 1994. I published it in 2004 because there was a controversy at the time, you may have known. Dr. David Kelly, he was a whistleblower on situation in Iraq when Tony Blair was going around saying weapons of mass destruction. And David Kelly was a chief weapons inspector in Iraq. And he was secretly talking to the BBC and saying, look, it's just not true. They have nothing. We've checked it all. It's completely wrong. And they eventually found out who was leaking it. And the next day he was dead. So something rather similar had happened in 1984 to somebody I knew who had been opposing a certain scientist, the scientist who stopped the whole practice of X-raying pregnant women. So this is one reason why I don't have a lot of respect for the UN, because the UN licensed the X-raying of pregnant women despite evidence that it might not be a good thing to do. And one scientist, Dr. Alice Stewart from Birmingham University, stood against the whole of the United Nations and every single scientific institution on the planet for 15 years to get that practice stopped. And you can imagine X-ray machines everywhere, quite a business, all the institutions that licensed it, they did not want to back down, they did not want to change. So I worked with Alice in a kind of legal way to get the regulations changed. So I'd seen how the scientific establishment can be so fundamentally wrong. So when David Kelly died under mysterious circumstances, and you can read there's journalists who've written about it, it reminded me of the death of somebody called John Riceland, who was a member of the nuclear establishment, and his job was to criticize Alice Stewart's work. Alice rang me one day and said, John Riceland is dead. I said, oh wow, he said, I knew him. And the day before, he had rang me, the day before he died, he rang me, and he said, you know, Alice, I'm coming around to actually think you're right. Next day he was dead. So this book is only facts, it's only my experience of a particular time in 1984. But it has a lot of other things in it, astrology, homeopathy, astral travel, things that I had some experience, not personally, I'm not a homeopath or astrologer or whatever, although I do study. But I witnessed it happening. And in fact, a group of martial artists that helped us in the Greenpeace campaigns. And there's a point in martial arts where you can leave the body and see things. And that's normally understood in the eastern part of the world, yoga, India, and so forth. Over here, it's woo-woo land. So all this is a commentary on what those guys found out, because they were surveilling the illegal dumping of nuclear waste off the British coast and feeding that information into Greenpeace. They provided the background knowledge for the actions on Big Ben, how to get up there, how to avoid all the various surveillance and security. So it's in there, and I didn't advertise it, but when the journalists got hold of that, not only the journalists, the head of Transition Towns, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, RSPB, they all said, you don't need to listen to what this guy is saying about climate change. He's clearly mad. He believes in astrology, homeopathy, astral travel. Well, it's nothing about belief. It's about witnessing. So I doubt that any single green or environmentalist would have actually read the book. And this is the situation that we're now in, where large sections of people that we care about, environmentalists particularly, think about Extinction Rebellion. I came back from abroad, 2018 I think. I saw the headlines, all these people on Westminster Bridge blocking the traffic. Extinction Rebellion. We are in a very dire situation with regard to species and wild places and biodiversity. There's no question about that. And I thought, wow, all these young people protesting about that. And then, but all the voices were climate, climate, climate. And I'm going, And several times I went to demonstrations and it was all like climate, climate. And they'd come to Parliament and go, do something. So the last people you should be asking to do something is the very people that are causing the problem. So it's like, it's not a rebellion. Is that a rebellion? Oh, something doesn't really add up here. So it's like, okay, let's try to communicate, try to talk. My family had strong connections in Wales with the organic farmer who was heading up that. You couldn't talk then. It's like, the shutters come down. You're a denier. What am I denying? So that's the background, and let's get down to some issues about should we be really worried, and what's the nature of the narrative? What's produced this sense of urgency and emergency, and what is the what are the critics saying? Now, this book was endorsed by the author of the Kyoto Protocol. So you can't get fairer than that. The guy who created and helped to create the framework, the UN framework, and he's saying here, hey, you should listen. He might be right. Those with you, those questions, and what's happened in the 10 years since that book was published. So first of all, this is a very typical graph of global warming. And what you'll get is you'll get a zero line, and for any technical people here, this is called an anomaly. So you set a zero line in terms of your average temperature over a particular time, and that's between 91 and 20. Traditional in climate science, you pick a 30-year period, you get the average temperature, that gives you the zero line, and this is what's happening. So it starts out below the average and goes up to here, slightly above. And this is a source that I totally have trust in. It's the University of Alabama, satellite-based. So they take the temperature of the whole planet, very sophisticated technology by NASA, and NASA gives the data to two sets of people, one a commercial organization called Remote Sensing, and the other is to the university. This university guy is total integrity, and so I trust this. And it doesn't accord with a number of other narratives, and this guy, who is an academic, had his officers machine gunned a year ago. You see the pock marks. In Alabama. In Alabama, yes. This is another compilation. So the first graph was pretty much this area here from 1979 when you had the satellite data. And so this is very largely from temperature measurements from land-based stations. I don't trust it. There's all kinds of fiddling going on, but I won't go into details there, just to tell you personally I don't trust it, but for purposes of argument, let's assume it's correct. And what you'll notice is here, the anomaly is 1850 to 1900. So 1850 to 1900, and then it starts to get warmer here. And then it warms up again. Now, it's when you get here that I don't trust things, but I can give you reasons for that. But basically, there's no carbon dioxide effect until about 1950. And I can justify that as perfectly normal science. There simply wasn't enough being put out by industry to alter the climate, and all the models that they've built, the UN models, assume that also. So we're trundling along here. Suddenly it gets warmer, it gets colder. So the first 20, 40, almost 40 years of massive release of carbon dioxide, the climate isn't warming at all. In fact, it's cooling. Then it takes off again. And this patch here is pretty much underhand, I would say, because these two peaks are caused by what's called super El Niños. We'll come to that a bit later. I would have no problem saying, yes, it's warmed by 1 degree. And I think this is a little bit pushing it, but it's on 1.2. Now there you think, wow, 1.2 degrees. We're on the course to, 2 degrees, and that's, the UN is telling us that's very dangerous. And here, this is the latest UN justification for the emergency. The temperature hasn't done very much for the last 2,000 years, and suddenly it's shot up. And these are computer models which say, because it's a computer model, you can take the carbon dioxide out of the equation and see what the temperature would do. It's all calculations. So they assume that without the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere, nothing much would change. And this is when you put the carbon dioxide in and the computer goes, and that's what, the black is what we've observed, and this is the computer prediction range. So they all think, oh right, our computers are correct, and this will carry on. So this is the official UN position. And you will have seen this graph plenty of times. It's a linear relationship. This is time, and this is carbon dioxide concentration. Now, one point here you will read occasionally, and it has been in the light paper, and I did explain this to Darren. This is not disputed by scientists. This is an increase of 100 parts per million. The normal level is 280. This is during our warm period outside of the Ice Age. And so we have seen that increase. And there's this meme going around, especially in the truth movement, that humans have only put out 4% of the carbon dioxide. How can that be significant? That's not true. This is 40% rise in carbon dioxide concentration, and this is about the highest level noted in the last 2 million years from ice core records, of which my little group, so I set up a little group 10 years ago. We've done some specialist work on the ice core record, and it's published in the scientific literature. So this is not normal. That carbon dioxide has to be coming from somewhere, and the assumption is that it's coming from our emissions. So I'm not questioning that. What I question, and it's taken me a lot of time to see this because it's a trick. This is a complete trick. The linear relationship that you see here is totally irrelevant to global warming, because the relationship of carbon dioxide to its power to warm is not measured in parts per million, it's measured in watts, just like your light bulbs are. And what happens is, how many of you have seen this non-linear relationship? That's wattage, this is concentration. So the wattage falls off with increasing concentration. It's called a log relationship. This is normal science, completely undisputed. So you think, well, where are we? Well, we're about here. So we are at the point where further increases of carbon dioxide have very, very little effect. And this graph you will not see. And just to put that into perspective, 40%, any ecologist, if you said, oh, we've increased carbon dioxide by 40%, any ecologist is going to say, oh, that's a bit much. But then you would ask, how much extra wattage does that equal? And you can do the calculation, it's about 1 watt. And then you think, well, what's the natural wattage that hits the surface of the planet? And it's coming from the sun, it's coming from clouds, it's coming from water vapor. It's a mixture of infrared and visible light. And it's all measured in watts. And it's called the flux at the surface. This is what keeps the whole planet warm. And actually, the planet cools down, the land cools down every night. And as you go out in the morning, you touch the earth, it's gone cold. Not the ocean. The ocean stores the heat. So this is the average over the whole planet per square meter is 240 watts. It's much more at the equator, much less at the poles. So the percentage change, what we've added to the natural dynamic, is not 40%, which is the only figure that's quoted by the media. It's 0.4%. It's less than 1%. The predicted increase, if you get up to, say, 560 parts per million, we're at 417 right now, still brings us to 1.5%. So, is that significant? And then you have to ask, okay, so can the planet handle this kind of percentage shift? What's the norm? What's the variability? Oh, this is a non-scary climate graph, okay? This is the Americans, they measure everything in Fahrenheit, so perfectly valid scientifically. This is, God knows how long ago, 1880, 2012 or whatever. It's not going to frighten anybody. This is 1 or 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase over that period of time. Of course, they don't show you this graph. Okay, so when I looked at the models and the data, it's like, well, there's no cycles in the models. And it's like, how come? And when I talked to the scientists involved, I said, cycles? We don't believe in cycles. I said, what do you mean? The whole of the paleoclimate community, all the people who study ice cores, sediments, tree rings, they all talk about cycles. They're wrong. Cycles are exact in physics, and they suddenly realize all these modelers are physicists and mathematicians. And a cycle, a Hertz cycle, it's exact, you can predict. Now the problem with real world cycles in nature is that the shorter ones are relatively exact and relatively predictable. The longer ones, and there's one about between 60 and 80 years, there's another one that's about 350 years. There's a really long one, which is about 1,000 years, but varies between 800 and 1,200. Now, we're only talking about the last 150 years and trying to predict the next 50 years. You can't put these cycles in because you don't know, A, you don't know where you are in the cycle, and B, you don't know how irregular it is. So, some time ago, wearing another hat as a social anthropologist, I gave a little seminar it was actually the World Congress of Anthropologists. They had a meeting on climate change. So I thought, I've noticed something about the models of climate change. And the scientists engaged in all of that, they don't like cycles. They don't like irregular periods. They don't like chaos. And they don't have any sense of spiral dynamics. And for any philosophers here, those are all what you might call feminine polarity. Spirals, chaos, irregular periods, they don't like it. So, they're not there. It's a complete blind spot in the models. So just to remind you that climate is cyclic, this is the Antarctic climate record over the last 400,000 years, or whatever, 500,000 years. And that's 50,000, yeah, that's 400,000. And this is in Greenland. So you can see in Greenland you've got a slightly different pattern, but this is just a snapshot of what's happening in the Antarctic between about 30 and 40,000 years ago. So we're right in the middle of the Ice Age. And this is what the planet is doing. These are excursions. This is the Ice Age. This is where we are now. These are little periods of warmth in the Earth's history. They last about 10,000 years. Then we go back into the Ice Age. The global temperature drops by about 5 degrees. And in Antarctica, it's more like 15. And in Greenland, in the Arctic, it's like 8 or 10. And then when we're here, these are about 10,000 years recently, but they're not always. Sometimes they're much shorter. And for any musicians amongst you, you might notice this is a harmonic. And this is what I call a beat cycle. Climate scientists don't even use the word. They don't know how to handle this. But this is like the harmonics of when you hit something like a bell, and it goes into harmonics. I don't personally understand the musical side of it, but this is a 8, 5, 3, 2, 1, 1, which is a Fibonacci series. It's the mathematics of a spiral. Nobody knows why, but there you can see, boomf, boomf, 10,000 years, 10,000 years. By the time we get here, this is 10,000 years. And you can see it's not very exact, but you can definitely see that there's cycles. Now this is during the warm period that we've been living in, the last 10,000 years. It's called the Holocene. So it's come up from the Ice Age, about 10,000 years ago. We're living in this period of warmth, but actually it's also a period of cooling, gradual cooling. So this is where we are now in the last 10,000 years. These cycles are much shorter, less amplitude, than the cycles in the Ice Age. This is about 3 degrees. So here we are now. This is the Arctic, this is the Greenland ice cap. So the Greenland ice cap has been much warmer in the past. But most importantly, little ice ages. And then Northern Europe gets very cold. So we're coming out of a little ice age. It's about 400 years. Now you remember that graph which was chugging along the bottom and then suddenly it goes up? Chugging along on the bottom is the little ice age. You hear about pre-industrial carbon dioxide levels, pre-industrial temperature. We're 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial. They don't say we're 1.2 degrees above the little ice age, but that is the truth of the matter. We're on schedule for another warm period, like these. Totally on schedule. And actually, if we go back here, this is a very recent piece of work by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And they have ways of measuring ocean temperature, looking at the isotopes within seashells. And so you see here, this is current, 1,000 years ago. You see there was a warm period, drops into the little ice age, about 1600, and then starts to come back up. The important thing here, 1850 to 1900, absolutely no carbon dioxide effect. 1900 to 1950, also no influence from carbon dioxide. This rate of change is no different than that rate of change or this rate of change. This peak is a little bit higher than the previous one. So you could say this global warming is what? 0.1 degree unusual. These are regional seas, this is the global average. So to any oceanographic scientist familiar with cycles, looking at the current situation, will go, nothing unusual here. So the climate is cyclic, and that is not acknowledged. You try to find any left, liberal, green newspaper that will talk about cycles, or that we're in one, or that we've been in one. It's just not in the narrative. And within the UN, there's a bit of skullduggery going on, and I've seen a lot of skullduggery in the UN, where they're desperately trying to get rid of the idea of cycles. They're trying to sort of obscure them. And any one scientist that manages to produce a graph that sort of irons it all out, they're immediately promoted to the UN. They're made lead author of the particular paleoclimate chapter. That happened to one scientist in Philadelphia called Michael Mann. And he produced what was infamously called the hockey stick. That was about 2001. The vice chair of the UN in 2001 was a Russian geophysicist called Professor Yuri Israel. So the vice chair of the UN, and he was pigeonholed by a journalist after the meeting in 2001, and he said, oh, we don't get it. All everywhere in the West, it's all hyped. All my scientists think it's a cycle. So the cycles are obviously natural. So the question that I was asking in the book is, what's the mechanism? How come we get these swings? And they're fairly regular or within bounds. So I'll just present to you where I've come to with this, and that is, and a number of other scientists also looking at it, the jet stream determines a number of things, not only the track of all the depressions that come in from the Atlantic. So when the jet stream is heading towards us, the Met Office will say, oh my God, we're going to get loads of cyclones coming in from the Atlantic, and it's wet and it's windy. And when the jet stream is a bit flatter, we'll either get, if it's north of us, we get warm air being sucked up from Africa. If it's south, as it is at the moment, we get cold Arctic air comes down. Our weather is completely determined by the jet stream. And so when I looked at it, I thought, well, this is interesting, because the jets seem to be more loopy than I remember them, just in the last 10, 15 years. This is a jet stream loop. It sucks up dry, warm air when it's on the up loop, and on the down loop, it sucks down the polar air. It's called a polar vortex. And it hit America particularly strongly in the last 2 or 3 winters, February in particular. And if we get that, it will hit us very strongly as well. But that happens mostly in the eastern side of the United States. It will happen with us, but the loop is almost north-south. I've seen where the loop turns south from Greenland, goes all the way down to the Azores and Canary Islands, comes all the way back up. It then pulls Saharan air up on one side and brings Arctic air down on the other. And we're right on the edge, so our weather can change very, very rapidly. But the physics of that, if you bring cold air towards the tropics and warm air up towards the Arctic, once you get above about 45 degrees, you're in an area of permanent heat loss. So when you hear that the Arctic is heating up, it's temperature. But what that really means is a lot of warm air has come up from, in our case, the Atlantic, up to the Arctic. It'll go up to the North Pole, and the press will go nuts. It's 20 degrees at the North Pole for a few days. Because what that means is heat is leaving the planet. And when the cold air comes down and cools the equator, it also means the planet is cooling. So if we have a percentage shift towards loopy jet stream, the planet will cool down. That's what I think is happening now. Now, we could talk about the exact mechanisms. Rather than go into that now, I would just say the media is assailing us at the moment with wildfires, sea level rise, polar ice meltdown, heat waves, droughts, floods, food supplies, hurricanes, loss of life, mass extinction, diseases. The press is full of it, the media is full of it, TV is full of it. What's the reality? In every single one of these cases, I can show you data which shows all of those are decreasing. Even the wildfires. There is not as many wildfires now on the planet as there were 50 or 60 years ago. Sea level rise is pretty inexorable, but it's 2 millimeters per year, and that hasn't changed since 1850. Polar ice meltdown happens in cycles, and it's opposite, one end of the planet to the other. The Arctic has definitely melted down. We've lost 50% of summer ice. But the Arctic did that only a few thousand years ago, when the last warm period. It was completely ice-free. The polar bears managed to survive that, no problem. Meanwhile, the Antarctic is not heating up at all. Just one little peninsula area that catches an ocean current has increased. The rest of it is stable. So that's also not good. Now, the heat waves, the droughts, the floods, hurricanes come in cycles. They're actually at the lowest they've been for a long time. Loss of life. All of those things have been increasing in the last 20 years. But you go back to the previous cycle, and they were greater in that time. And in particular, loss of life now from disasters is much less than it was 100 years ago. So almost every single one of those indexes, and if you want the actual data, then give me your email afterwards and I'll send you all the links. But I've checked all of them out. The only index that you could say, oh, that's increasing, is the intensity of rainfall. But we're 1 degree above where we were. So all of that is absolutely expected. What has changed? Take Pakistan, for example. Loss of life, massive flooding. It's on a 100-year cycle. There was equal amount of flooding and rain, and you can see the data. What's the difference in 100 years in Pakistan? Population. Where do they live? They don't live in the desert. They live in the floodplain. And it's the same in North America. Vast settlements in what would be called savanna forest, which burns. And the trees are actually fairly resistant to it. But thousands and thousands of retired people in their little bungalows surrounded by rosemary bushes and other incendiary stuff. And you can see the houses are burnt to a cinder and the trees are still there. And it's just a grass fire that's normal in the savannah. So all of that is, in my view, hype, and all of the data doesn't back it up. And this scientists do know, and that's why you will often say, oh, well, we can't really ascribe it with certainty to global warming. So here then we have turbines, solar panels, electric cars, biofuels, nuclear fission, carbon sequestration, and go vegetarian, or the mombiotic diet, which is, I think, some kind of insect mush. Or you could emigrate with Elon. no hydrogen planes, nuclear fusion. I have to smile. The first person to join my research group was a Balliol physicist, doctoral level. He worked on nuclear fusion at Culham. This was the leading edge science of his time. It's called Gordon Thompson, who's an engineer. I said, "You want to work with us?" He said, "Yeah, it's crazy. It's a religious quest to create the sun on Earth. Fusion will never happen." So that was 1976, right? So billions of dollars later, they are now saying in the papers, we've managed to create a little bit more energy than we put in. That's not actually true. Because they didn't take account of how much energy it took to create the lasers that created the energy to compress the hydrogen. And they tout this as this will be the answer, this will solve all of our problems. But it's been 50 years, and I can guarantee another 50 years they'll be saying the same thing. We'll get there. Carbon sequestration, it's minute. Vegetarian diet, that would make a difference. Biofuels, you've seen the problems of. Nuclear fission, it's okay until it goes wrong. And just as a political note, to do with regulating technology, all the parliaments were told in 1950 nuclear fission reactors cannot melt down. And then they got the regulation, and they got all this, everything was going full on. 60s, 70s they were building it. It was 1975, and this was our group in Oxford. We discovered the secret reports that were going, oh, well, it's not entirely true, right? If it melted down, you'd have a problem. But even then they tried to cover it up and said, well, if it melted down, the containment would work. Without telling us that the British reactors don't have a containment, because they don't think it will ever melt down. And in 1983, we were engaged by the emergency services unions. These are the fire brigade, the police. They would have to go in if there was a fire. And we were telling them, look, guys, if they've lost the containment, you're going into a death zone. This was 1983. So you really need to have different instructions because they're not telling you the truth. So that's when trade unions were interested enough to get a second opinion. 1986, Chernobyl, the Russians hadn't been told. And the firemen and the police and everyone, they just went into death zones, and it's a horrible death. It takes a month to die from overdose of radiation, and very painful. So this is the kind of information that I have to hand if you need it. This is accumulated cyclone energy. So this is hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones. And what do you see? You see a cycle. It's on a roughly 60-year. And actually right now there's less cyclonic energy on the planet than there was 20 years ago. Much less. And again, it's on a cycle. And so what's ultimately causing these cycles? Now this is something that nobody knows for sure, but there are correlations. These are sunspot cycles. You just got to mention that, and the scientists who built the models, they'll go, oh, the sunspot thing. So it's just a correlation at this stage. It's by no means shown. But here you have an indication of what the climate has been doing. 2000 BC, Somerset, where I live, there were pelicans nesting. If you go back 1,000 years, not only were there Vikings farming in Greenland, but white stork, which are just starting to nest in Sussex right now. They were nesting as far north as Edinburgh. The Romans were cultivating vineyards up by Hadrian's Wall 2,000 years ago. And If you go back 6,000 years, the whole of the Arctic was ice-free in the summer. And there's a bit of a correlation there, and so a lot of, where my thinking is, at the height of the sunspot cycle, there is a strong amount of ultraviolet light. And the most recent research, and this is only in the last 10 years, is that the pulses of ultraviolet, which are much greater than the changes in the visible spectrum, they impact the jet stream. And that's what I think is controlling this jet stream pattern. So this is another correlation. This is using isotopes from the Antarctic in red, Greenland in green. This is the sunspots that we've actually been able to observe since about 1650 with telescopes. Here you're extrapolating from certain isotopes which fall out into the ice fields, and you can measure them, and those isotopes are related to the flux of energy from the sun. And so here you can see this is a warm period. No, sorry, that's the Maunder minimum, and that's the medieval maximum. That's when the white storks were nesting in Edinburgh. And this is when the Thames was freezing over. So there's a correlation. It's no more than that at this stage. But when I see that, I think, okay, let's look closely at the solar effects and what radiation is happening. So I want to finish this stage of presentation so we can move on to more of a discussion, or is there anything that's not clear for you? With the sense of, okay, so what's actually been happening during this period of global warming and climate emergency, and every scientific establishment on the planet is now on message. The Russians have fallen in line, the Chinese have fallen in line. They weren't, even the Americans weren't in line 20 years ago, but they're all in line now. And it's my understanding that's what's driving not just the carbon dioxide, but the loss of forest, loss of soil, pollution of the water, loss of biodiversity, is the actual development model. It's what the investors want to invest in. They decide what gets built. Nobody can do anything much without borrowing money, even governments. So you have to look to who the decision makers are in relation to what investments happen, what technology, where, what kind of economic growth, what's the economic growth model, who benefits. And so in 2010, I started getting calls from the bankers. Nobody else wanted to talk to me after I published that book, apart from the true movement actually at that time. But the bankers did. I said, listen, we can't talk to you officially, but we'll pay your fare, first class, we'll give you breakfast at the Ritz, bring some of your books, we want to talk to you. So the first meeting, there's about 20 analysts from all the top banks, all around one big breakfast table in the Ritz. And they were asking questions about this book, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So you've read it? The analysts had taken apart every part of that book. They wanted to know about the cycles, the oscillations, and so forth. And they said, we can't pay you, right? But I did get one paid gig. I had a guy who decided he was going to be my agent over there. He said, I want to get you in front of the decision makers. I said, I've got you a gig. This is a board level meeting. And these are the top investment bankers in the city. So I arrived, I had my little briefcase, and my PowerPoint presentation, and my, the little data key disappeared. Oh my God. So I can't do this, and I've got all the data and everything, so all right, I'm going to have to ad-lib here. So I go in, There's a big board level table, and very distinguished gentlemen all around it. And so I said, I know you want to know what the climate's going to do and whether this carbon credit bubble will break or not. And if they know which way it's going to go, then they place their bets and they can make money, whatever happens, right? So I know why you want me here. You want to know if this bubble's going to break. And I'm not sure it will, personally. It could. It very much depends on El Nino, what happens. I'll show you a little bit later. Because at the moment it's going down, and if it continues to go down, then the whole credit thing will collapse, right? But I want to ask you a question. There's such a thing called ethical and sustainable investment funds, is there not? Yeah. Okay. What percentage of your investments are in that fund, in that category? They looked a bit sheepish. I said, this is about 1%, isn't it? Yeah. Right. So 99% of what you're doing here is completely unethical and not sustainable. We have to agree. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? We can't do anything. I mean, they were really genuine. I mean, I expected to go into a meeting with a lot of bad guys. And it was like, I'm quite sensitive, really. And it was like, oh, they're really, they were very well dressed and smart and distinguished looking, but they were very nice people. And they genuinely apologized and said, we'd love to change it, we can't. We're stuck. The system. So this is what they've been doing with our money. These are all insurance, investments, financial services. 25% of the US economy, which is equal to 170 GDPs of other countries, 170 other countries, just one US, bigger than that. Look at China, look at Singapore, look at New York, look at Abu Dhabi. Wherever you look, you see these. Who's in there? Right? Thousands and thousands and thousands with desks. They actually offered me a desk. I said, I already got a desk. They said, no, come in. You're a very smart analyst. I thought, I could have a Porsche and impress my daughter. She lives in London. That's investment bankers, fundamentally. And what they invest in and are trapped in is more and more and more of that for themselves. And I recently read in the Times, I have to read the Times every day because I want to know what they're thinking. Elon Musk is no longer the richest man on the planet. He's been overtaken by some French guy who is head of a massive empire that makes luxury goods, handbags and that kind of thing. Dior, Louis Vuitton. He's the richest man on the planet. And they're laughing. The rich people are buying stuff like that. Like nobody's business. They've increased their stock by 44%. During COVID, the rich people, like Elon, they increased their shareholdings by 36%, whereas everyone else went down 10%. The flow of capital to China increased massively. And all of that Amazonian stuff with Bezos and so on, it's all made in China, as you probably know. So I have a Chinese artist friend, took this photo. She's interested in trees, because the Chinese are doing interesting things with trees. They capture them in the wild, and they bring them into their new cities, which are building. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God, look at the scale. Look at the scale. Concrete, steel, that I don't know which city that is, but it's kind of like Wuhan. Wuhan was a little backwater on the Yangtze River 30 years ago. It's now one of the biggest cities in China, and it has other things that it's famous for as well. So this is the development model. And that is the problem. That is what's taking out the biodiversity. And if you try to power this from renewables, you will create, first of all, it's not possible and you waste a lot of money, but en route, you make life unlivable, especially in a place like Britain. It's very small. So this is the issue, really, for me. Next we come to, what do we do about it? So that's the point where I like to stop haranguing you with data and stuff. But I will say, if there are any amongst you who would like data on wildfires, floods, droughts, indexes of hurricanes, all of that kind of stuff, just give me your email and I'll send it to you so you can see for yourself. I've got it all there, but it would take all night to show you with the graphs. Thank you, and I would welcome a discussion.
It's highly fascinating. I'm just wondering, what do you think about sort of chemtrails and weather alteration? To what extent does it affect what's going on?
So the question is, what do I think about chemtrails? I have a younger brother. He's not a scientist, he's an activist. And when we were in Greenpeace 1982, he'd just come back from cycling around the Mediterranean. He was glowing, he was fantastic. And so Ron, we need somebody brave enough to go on an action. So yeah, I'd like to help Greenpeace. So yeah, you have to walk into the Nevada desert in full radioactive protection gear. It's kind of hot. Into their nuclear weapons testing site and hide. And then you've got this little radio and you say, and then they have to stop the test. So he did that. And he led the team that climbed Big Ben, and he led the acid rain campaigns throughout Europe. And for that, he gets no pension. And he's been working as a kind of tree surgeon in the forests of Wales, God knows how long. And now he can't work much more, and he's got a dicky shoulder, and he spends all his time. And he's gone really deep down the rabbit hole that we all know about. And I've watched that with trepidation. And so there are memes that occur. And there's a lot of truth there, there's no question. But there's also a lot of other things too. And chemtrails is one of them. In the current multimedia environment, you can post something that looks like bottles of poison coming out of an aeroplane, and it gets 1 million hits and you make money, or somebody makes money. So I've done my best to look at what's really true. The only people that I know who've been using chemtrails to try and affect sunlight on any scale whatsoever are the Russians. And they publish their results. And the rest of the scientific community looking with great interest, because what you do, you have to get up into the stratosphere and spray basically something like barium sulfate. And it's a reflective dust, and it will reflect the sun's rays. We know this because when a volcano is powerful enough to push up into the stratosphere, it puts in various sulfates, and they reflect. And global temperature drops. So the scientists are looking, oh, we can do that. And this is completely nuts because you'd have to have a huge number of aeroplanes, millions of tons of material, and it doesn't stay there for very long, 2 or 3 years. So you have to keep replenishing it. I mean, it's nuts. But you can get governments to pay you to study whether it's nuts or not, right? And so the interesting thing about the Russian study was led by the former vice chair of the IPCC, Yuri Israel, geoscientist, Moscow Academy of Sciences. And he'd been hammering away at Putin, saying, look, it's all nuts. I mean, it's a cycle. It's not real, right? And then Putin was okay with that until the point where he signed eventually the Kyoto Protocol and got billions of dollars of carbon credits for Russian industry, right? So he phoned up Mr. Israel and he said, I don't want you putting out that story anymore. And as a compensation, I've got a little study I'd like you to do on cooling the planet. So Yuri Israel took the King's shilling and did the study and published it in the Russian Journal of Hydrology and Meteorology. And basically it's like, it's not going to work. So within the scientific community, they know it won't work. It's too big a thing. It can't be done, really. And so nobody's doing it. And the recent British government report on this issue, because the questions are asked in Parliament, what's going on? They're ambiguous. But you've got to look at the terms, and when you read those terms, you can see they're not interested in chemtrails in order to change the temperature. They're interested in other technologies, carbon capture particularly. But the other one is not happening within the scientific world. However, back to my brother, they have photographs in West Wales. Now we know the environment in West Wales very well. There are no major flight paths. And there you see this, pattern.
Yeah, but here a lot as well.
And it's like, well, that's military. There's nobody else can do that. I mean, you're not going to get commercial airlines doing it or whatever, and nobody could keep such a thing quiet. The number of people who have to be involved, and so the pilots and the crew and the tonnages involved, no. But the military can be doing it. So what they might be up to, I don't know. And people say, oh, there's some kind of substance coming down and so on. So there's something there. But I don't know any more than that. And I've done my best to find out what's going on open levels. As a scientist, I can talk about it. But the rest, I just don't know. Something is going on.
I'd just like to ask you something about, and having presented a kind of very interesting, well, it's incredibly important. I mean, last weekend, the big news was all around this coal mine in Whitehaven, and all the various sort of factions, were arguing the case. And one thing that came out of it was that by kind of going ahead with it, the UK would lose its credibility as a kind of leader in sort of sustainability and reducing the carbon emissions, etc. But having said that, what you said today, it feels like it's quite a small thing around that. It's actually, maybe it's not even a major issue, but how do you see that particular issue, and then how do we kind of take on the sort of dealing with the emissions issue, or dealing with the issues?
Yeah.
When what you said is you kind of downplay it as an important.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously not a matter of carbon emissions to me. What the climate does next, will not be affected by any emission controls. Even if the UN model was correct, and definitely isn't, it's out by a factor of 2 or 3, we still wouldn't affect it. There are various technical ways in which you can show that. It takes decades. Within the next 10 years, there'll be another 1 billion people on the planet, inexorably. So there are much more important issues than the carbon emissions. The real question comes down to lifestyles. I would almost guarantee, looking at you and myself, that if the rest of Britain lived a lifestyle that you live and that I live, the economy would collapse. There would be millions of people out of work. The financial world would collapse. Those guys would have nothing to invest in. Their world would collapse. The whole financial system would melt down. So it's very I don't buy stuff. My car's 10 years old. The previous one was 20 years old. I don't watch TV. I don't go for entertainment. You know, I get a lot out of music. Not that I'm a musician, but listening, and friends, artists, musicians, poets. This is where life is.
But in a way, that's really unsustainable in terms of the status quo, isn't it?
So the rest of the world is not like that. There's a lot of poverty on the planet, and as you can see from the migrants who are trying desperately to get here, they're economic migrants. They're not, some of them obviously asylum seekers, but the vast numbers, and it's not just us. Spain recently legitimized 5 million people, all of whom had come from the Spanish colonies. Germany, the migrants, there's millions of them, and they do most of the jobs that need doing and low pay. That's a fact. But the rest of the world is in an economic crisis, and as prices rise, commodity prices rise, those countries are going to be in dire straits. They already are. And then the environment suffers. So it's the model that has to change, the lifestyle model. And at the same time, how do you do that when you know that if you did it quickly, the system would collapse? So
can I just say something very quickly about science and then ask you a question? For me, the most important thing, the stuff you said about cycles, I think is so incredibly important. And for me, out of all the wonderful things you've said, the most important thing for me was when you said that if we're in a multiplicity of cycles, then actually we can never know at what point we are, into one of those cycles, and like just to let the impact of that in. And then like the other day, one of the Extinction Rebellion people came up to our stall, and we got talking. And she said, "One thing I can't stand is your position on climate change." And I asked her, so do you think that the science is settled on this? Oh yes, the science is completely settled. So these people are convinced that this simplistic, positivistic science is settled, and there's no discussion to be had. Whereas, as soon as you bring in the whole concept of cycles, there's at least the possibility that that narrow science is completely wrong. So I think it's important to say that. So that's a statement. And my question is, could you help me with the distinction between global warming and climate change, whether those two terms, narratives, are referring to the same thing? When did that narrative change? Why did it change? I don't know enough about it to know whether when I'm talking about global warming, I'm also talking about this notion of climate change.
Yeah.
My sense is that climate change is a much more flaky notion scientifically than global warming. I'd just like to hear your views on that.
Yeah, well, it's a difficult one because I don't know where the phrase global warming started. Maybe in the 90s or whatever. But
Rome and Maurice Strong.
Maurice Strong.
Maurice
Yeah.
Green.
So after about 20 or 30 years of warming and all of those UN initiatives, carbon dioxide didn't change, and the temperature was still going up, not as much as they predicted it would. And if you look at, I haven't showed the data, but you could analyze all the major crops in the world. They're all going up at that period. And wealth is going up, poverty is going down. You know, there are lots of indices. And so the realization was, amongst what has changed, and I'll talk about that in a minute, well, why should people be afraid of warming? And so what you'll notice now is the change in the narrative. It's global heating. And you see that in The Guardian. They don't talk about global warming. Now, when climate change came in, it was like, well, isn't the climate always changing? And the scientists would have to say, well, yes, you know, they can't deny the cycles and the fact that... But it sort of got narrowed down, and the UN set up this special committee or panel to study anthropogenic climate change, right? And they were not given the remit to study natural climate change. So that the bias was already there at the beginning within the UN. And that's where their climate change meant what we've done. So to a paleoclimatologist who's got climate change, well, it's always doing that, yeah, sure. But to a UN policy wonk, it's like, well, yeah, climate change, that's what we're doing to it. So there you've got those ambiguities. Now climate change is being phased out. Not so much by the UN, because they have a panel on climate change and they can't really change that name without obvious consequences. But if you look at the media, it's climate destruction. Climate disruption, climate destruction, climate crisis, climate emergency, and so forth. Now, this is something that has changed enormously in the time that I've been watching all of this. And that is that large amounts of money have gone into media networks, and I'm talking billions of dollars here. And this was originally orchestrated by Al Gore, who set up a very large media empire after he failed to become president. And they have enormous influence throughout TV, media, everywhere you look. And of course, by the time you get to Twitter and YouTube and so forth. Now, I know you'll all be familiar with what's happened in the last 2 years. The deplatforming, the censorship, there's no discussion. And even when they're caught, like the whole UN said this virus has come from a snake or a pangolin or whatever, zoonotic. They were still saying that when the Chinese themselves were saying, actually, we searched completely the whole of that wet market and we didn't find anything. So it's not come from there. And the finger then points to the lab in Wuhan, right? You all know that. So the UN then sets up a special group to go to China, and it's one of its chief scientists, a guy called Peter Daszak. He had been taking US money to work with that Chinese lab on zoonosis, which is the possibility of a virus from, say, the jungle coming and evolving and giving us a hard time. So they were interested in the work over the Wuhan Institute, which was the only place on the planet that was looking at bat viruses. Now, bat viruses have been a problem in Africa. So it's like, oh, all right, bat viruses, you're working on bat viruses. So what happens if one of these bat viruses evolves, jumps to a human? There were 8 deaths in a mine in China from a bat virus. Oh, so it can kill. Oh yes, it's quite deadly, but it's not transmissible. Can you make it transmissible? Just in case nature did it, or worse. And then you see, Wuhan, it's not just a commercial lab with vast investment. And if you look at who's invested in Wuhan, there's all those guys in the skyscrapers. Because the main money to be made from virus research is actually to protect all the pigs and the poultry, all the vast concentrated flesh close together is very susceptible to viruses, and they're vaccinated all the time. So there's vast amounts of money to be made, and that's why all the investment funds went into Wuhan and they built the institute. But this is China, and inside that little institute there's a little office of the Chinese Communist Party military wing, and just down the road there's the military lab. Nobody talks about this. So the military go, not transmissible, eh? Said, yeah, well, we've got it evolving here with ferrets, and they've got similar lungs to humans, and, you know, slow process. The military lab doesn't have the same restrictions. They can take bits from another virus and create something totally in case the terrorists do it. And then you can work on a vaccine and so forth. This kind of work is going on all the time in dozens of labs all over the planet. 15 years ago, a Dutch lab working with bird flu said, we've managed to get it so that it's not normally transmissible amongst humans, just birds. But it's fundamentally very lethal. It's like 50% of people who get it die. So we've made it transmissible. And part of the money was coming from the United States, and the United States said, well, for God's sake, don't publish that. Oh, we believe in freedom of publishing. And there was a big fight, and eventually the Dutch were overruled. So the genetics is not publicly available. But that kind of work is going on all of the time. And what do the press do? Nothing. And even when, the one government that stood out against this UN committee that went to Wuhan and said, oh, we don't see anything wrong here, said, well, you've got Peter Daszak on there. He's the one who was paying Wuhan to do that research. And that his money was coming from the US Department of Defense. So China says to Australia, we buy a lot of coal from you. And they put heavy pressure on the Australians. And the Australians stood against that pressure. So this is the kind of shenanigans that's going on. That's COVID. But this is the world development model. And this is the pyramid where all the money goes. And this is the oligarchies of Bezos, Amazon, made a fortune during COVID. The pharmaceutical industry made a fortune. Governments were throwing hundreds of billions at it, right? So my own take on this, for what it's worth, is it's completely mad, unstoppable. This is a civilization in decline. And there's one cycle that I haven't talked about. It comes from a Chinese geophysicist called Kenneth Su, HSU. He wrote a paper in 1998. He looked at all of those climate cycles, and he looked at all of the solar cycles as well. And he said, these little ice age, that little ice age, for example, it should really be called the Dark Age. And in fact, some people do call it the Dark Age, and then there's a previous 1,000 years before that was also called the Dark Age. And he looked at the Dark Ages almost every 1,000 years. And there's a bit of Russian research, it's not very supportable, But when the solar magnetic field drops, that's also coincides with when it gets cold, and when you get these dark ages, that research showed it affected stocks and shares and confidence. So it's a bit like, as the magnetic field changes, or something from the sun changes, human confidence drops. And during those dark ages, every single time, and this is what Kenneth Sue was pointing out, the empires which had overextended their supply lines collapsed. Where are the Normans? Rubble, dust. Where are the Romans? Rubble and dust. Where are the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Mayans? All empires. So
You always get this massive opulence just before.
yeah. So I'm thinking, all right, we're on the edge of a dark age. It's going to go down. That's what I think. We're at the end of that beat cycle. At the end of every 10,000 year cycle, it stops. It doesn't repeat. So it takes a while, 3,000 years, to drop into an ice age, but it goes down like this. And you can trace that to the ice cores. So I think, okay, so I've just got to watch it all fall apart and decline. And that's what's happening to me. People are, yeah.
Can I just, we've touched on a number of themes tonight, and some implicit themes. You started, for me anyway, correct me if I'm off, with talking about ecology, and that's, pollution comes into that, and perhaps your reference, we've got a climate emergency is to do with that, species of the planet. So we've got to deal with pollution. The main part of your talk has been a very interesting subject to me, which is about climate and what you put forth. We're talking about what we're going to do about it. But the thing that we haven't talked about, and that I don't know whether you know much about, is the intention by, that's a very powerful group of families, and if we really went down the rabbit hole, we might have to go a long way. But what I'm referring to is that there's an agenda here which is perhaps field wars over hundreds and thousands of years, a number of what we're calling the darker activities of the human race that is now at its height. If you really research what happened during COVID, you couldn't but wonder how on earth was it, did democracy and some of the basic values of democracy disappear overnight, and people were censored and nobody said anything about it, although you can put that down a certain amount of human psychology. I work in psychology. But I guess, are you au fait with, do you have an awareness that there are, let's say, a group of very powerful human beings that are probably psychopathic in nature, who really are not coming from the basis of love, where I would hope the majority of us are coming from, and that has to be put into what's going on because they want to use climate as a Trojan horse for bringing forth their cooperatives, but also what would be called the fourth industrial revolution, and it's not coming from the best. So, do you accept there are this group, and how do you see them fitting into the whole, mainstream media and making sure that everything follows, this climate agenda and net zero, and as a result, our liberties will be curtailed in all sorts of ways that apparently is coming from a worthy base. So that's another whole area that fits into this huge jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to get to understand.
So did everybody hear that okay? Yeah. There's always a problem for me to answer that, because I have still almost at the end of my ambitions to influence the scientific world at this stage. But I still have a few things in the pipeline, which I'm trying to talk to them. A couple of years ago, I was invited to go to Princeton, talk with the top modelers behind the UN. Hey, come on, what can we do? Help us. Exactly what happened before. And I run up against the mombiotic response of he believes in astral travel and all kind of stuff. So I have been researching this in depth for a number of years, and I can look at it from other perspectives, and just even to talk about those perspectives can get you wiped out in terms of your credibility in scientific circles. But that's pretty ineffective at this stage. You know, I still think there's a lot of good scientists out there, and I would like to be involved. But now is the time to really come clean. And so I am actually working on a book, and part of my research, and I shall be talking with a Stroud person tomorrow around, who's a specialist in a particular period of time, 1600, 1650. I became very interested in this period because the people that we now see at the top of the pyramid, you know, this is China. We think China's a country. It's not. We think Chinese is a people. It's not. This is China. It's an investment opportunity. It's a factory. It's a workhouse with low-paid, unregulated, no environmental concerns, human rights completely obliterated, total surveillance, and vaccinated up to the hilt. We've seen it, clearly. And this has all been invested in by those bankers in those towers. And they're nearly all men. And so who are they? And I've been into those towers. I've been round the board table. I've talked with them, but I'm also looking at things with an inner eye, because I'm a yogi. I've spent time in the Himalayas with the Himalayan master. I spend a lot of time with shamans. A lot of my friends have been women who have incredible skills of being able to leave their body and see things and report. And I'm reading a little piece by James I, who is regarded as the father of modern Freemasonry. And in 50 years from his reign to the foundation of the Royal Society, which is the preeminent scientific society, and that's what we're dealing with, the scientists took over. Before that, they were philosophers and alchemists. Alchemy is an inner path to realization of knowledge, and it requires an alchemical marriage. It requires an equal relationship with man and woman. And there are yogic practices which are similar, called Tantra. In order to become the most balanced and full human being that we can be, we have to balance the male and the female energies inside of ourselves. Even Jesus said that. A man must become like a woman must become like a man. It got a bit edited in various places, but what does it mean? What it means is that when those currents, energy currents, are in balance, another thing can happen. Before that, it can't happen. And so this is Eastern knowledge of balance and harmony, and when that energy flows, it ignites the human heart. And the human heart is regarded as a feminine realm. So if you want to build this empire, the one thing you've got to do is disable the power of the feminine. Well, it's not that difficult to do in the male. In a competitive world and the type of education and so forth, it's been relatively easily done. Scientific education, women are educated exactly the same as men. But with women, wild women, it is not so easy. You know, what do you mean I can only, if I get baptized, you know, you won't persecute me? Fuck you. That's generally what they did. And you know what happened to them. In Scotland under James I, they were dunked underwater. Now, a good Christian would not drown. Ah, they drowned. That just proves they were a witch. And of course, in the continent they were burnt alive. And not just the women. Giordano Bruno was an alchemist, 1600. The church wasn't that bothered about the sun and all that kind of philosophy. He was an activist. He was fomenting rebellion, equality and love. The same James I's daughter, Elizabeth, she became the Queen of Czech Republic, well, in those days Bohemia. She married an alchemist, and they wanted to set up an ideal kingdom in the centre of Europe where man and woman would be equal and love would reign supreme. There's a wonderful place near Prague, you can go and see it. There used to be an exhibition of their alchemical lives. And it's full of art and wonder. And the church launched a crusade, mostly led by Spanish mercenaries, wiped them. Battle of White Mountain, 1618. End of the real Enlightenment, Renaissance, or whatever. And what you have now is a direct consequence of that shift, the takeover. Royalty, no more. The new royals, the Royal Society, scientists, they become the chief advisors, and that's what's driving this whole thing, in my view, is a complete imbalance of the male and the female. These are lost fathers, out of touch with the feminine within themselves. Their heart, whatever they do, they shut it down. When they get in those glass towers, I've seen them walking around, and they actually have this thing about we are the masters of the universe, aren't we? In their smart suits and their Porsche. And then you get women wearing suits and driving Porsches as well, and they've been educated and so on. So it's like, to me, this is the problem, the imbalance. I've called it the dangerously imbalanced, monstrous male mind, the dim. And we've handed into the hands of these people 10,000 nuclear-tipped missiles, plutonium weapons. You only need 200 to destroy the planet. Not by explosions, but it pumps up dust into the stratosphere. Nuclear winter, all the plants die, all the ocean dies. That can happen. That can happen tomorrow. That is how mad it's become. Mutually assured destruction. Mad. So, how do we rescue these people? And there's a thing in the shamanic world called shamanic journey. You can go out there and look around. And so some people do it within this world. But you can also go into other realms of what I would call the psychosphere. And I don't usually do that kind of thing, but at one point I did. And I thought, I want to talk. I once talked with these guys on a, shall we say, an imaginary level, a psychic level. They had all their hoods on and they were around, and it was like, why don't you work with us? And I was like, where are your women? You're completely isolated from your own feminine, and look what you're doing. You build all these nukes and weapons and everything. I've got total respect for your engineering capacity. we haven't had a meltdown in the UK. That's high quality engineering. These guys know what they're doing. I've got total respect for this. But where's your eco-sustainable communities? You were building those things, you were doing those things, I'd be with you. And then one of them let slip, this was 2004, just let slip from his mind. And it was like, oh, whoa, you're planning to release a virus that will take down the human population? Oh, you know, hey, that's way beyond your level, you know, it's like, you can't do that. You won't be allowed to do that. And I really thought that. So when I came out of that particular journey, I checked all the scientific literature on what the virus people were doing, what they were making. For about 5 years I followed that. And there were things happening that you couldn't believe. One lab in Canada posted in the normal post live smallpox virus to 10 other labs. And it's like, if you want something to happen that's illegal and nobody's going to agree to help you, you have to dream it happening by accident. Wuhan. So it's like, shamans will tell you, you want to change the world, you dream it. And these guys with the hoods behind all of this, here. And in yogic knowledge, if you disable the base chakra, you generate insecurity. The whole of the US economy is founded on insecurity. So then you can control people. Then the energy can't flow up. And if it does, if people do feel secure for a moment, they become very sexual. That's natural, that's human nature. So what happens then is all that energy is pulled out by the media, by the educational system. Most of us guys were educated by fellow 11-year-olds. Nobody initiated us, nobody told us how to cultivate sexual energy. It was blown away. So it's not available then to come higher, to the belly. This is the power center. Any martial artist will tell you this is where your power is. It's the hara. You extend ki. And it's like, you haven't got any power in your belly. You've no authority. You haven't got your own authority. You're at the effect. Every single man is born into a psychic web of power. You know who's got power over you, where the authority lies, and you have to navigate that. And so by then, there's no energy to come to the heart. And so all of these religions which bring down the light, heart, once those people get threatened in any way, all that love disappears. The Christians will bomb the hell out of you, if you threaten them. So it's like, there's no power in the heart. If there's no power in the heart, there's nothing in the voice. Nobody dares to speak. And if it can't get higher, this is the vision center, this is where we dream. People have no vision. And then that's what you've got. And in COVID, my God, did you see it? It's like walking amongst zombies. My partner and I wandered down through Bath the other day. Bath's a lovely city, and I always enjoyed going there. So I said, what's wrong? It's like being amongst zombies. Sandra said, did you see the woman on the bicycle? That's what made me think I'm in a zombie movie, right? Just rode past, and I was like, oh my God, what is it? And that's it. And from followers of Rudolf Steiner here, maybe, any? He said there will come a time when they will inoculate against spirit. What does that mean? What it means is, be afraid and turn to us, the scientists. Follow the science. We will protect you. Not your spirit, not your energy, not your own immunity. In fact, all of that was repressed during COVID times. So it's like, this is the monster that we're dealing with. And the only bit of good news that I can give you is that when I was out there going, where are the bad guys? Not that I was going to fight or anything, I just wanted to, check it out. I couldn't find them. And some sort of weird angelic voice, I don't usually hang out with angels, but it said, don't you realise you won? I said, we won? Yeah, 2012, don't you remember? All the yogis, all the shamans, all the nice people singing, you all got together, we danced, we did an incredible dance in that year, 2012. And it was like, okay, this is the end of the world, probably, the Mayans and all of that. So let's be the best of who we are. So she, I like to think of in the center of the galaxy, is not a black hole, but it's something that the Native Americans call Spider Woman. And her job is to weave the future, the dreams of the future. And she has to have something to work with. So it's we give her the threads with which she weaves the cloth of the future. And up until now, the American dream is the strongest dream. And there's laws of the universe which say, well, okay, that's what you want, that's what you're going to get, right? So that's all going to come down. It'll take 300 years, but it is going to come down. So our job is to rebuild this whole human being from the base upwards and to protect our communities. The seeds. That's you guys.